Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Shiva Extreme. This is the newest primal encounter made available by patch 2.4 Dreams of Ice. I've had a lot of people ask for this guide, saying I've been giving it the cold shoulder, but I think you need to let it go. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your raid guide. You'll find that most groups will tank Shiva just north of the center of the room, with the raid stacked on her butt in the middle. This allows for optimal movement for any incoming mechanics. This is a 3-phase encounter, with the mechanics in each phase highly dependent on which weapon stance Shiva is currently in. In the first phase, Shiva will alternate between sword and staff stances. In the second phase, the raid will deal with adds and sword stance. In the final phase, you'll have to deal with sword, staff, and bow stance, along with a few additions to certain mechanics you've seen before. 2 mechanics that you will see throughout the entirety of the fight are Dreams of Ice and ICICLE Impact. Dreams of Ice is a permanent stackable buff that will slowly increase her outgoing damage over time. Theoretically, this acts as a very soft enrage timer for the fight, but I wouldn't worry about it too much as the DPS requirements for this encounter aren't very strict. ICICLE Impacts are large ground-based AoE circles that spawn in set patterns around the room. Anyone hit by falling ice will gain a vulnerability debuff, so it's best to avoid these as much as possible. The patterns of these impacts can easily be predicted once you see the first set, similar to Titan's bombs. Quickly recognizing the patterns and reacting to them appropriately will allow you to dodge these areas like a pro. In the first phase, there are 2 of 3 possible stances, sword and staff. Sword and staff will each put up a stacking debuff that increases the damage done to the target by the opposing weapon. For example, sword stance will increase blunt damage taken with each stack, and staff will increasing slashing damage taken. Theoretically, Shiva switching between these 2 weapon stances would call for a tank swap. However, even with high stacks of a debuff, it is still possible to single tank with proper cooldown usage. This is entirely between your tanks and healers, so figure out if you want to solo or dual tank it, and swap appropriately if necessary. Anytime Shiva switches to a new weapon, she will fly up into the air like so, and select her new weapon. After each switch, she will immediately cast that weapon's special ability. Sword Stance will trigger Ice Brand, a massive frontal cone that hits for about 18,000. This damage must be split and shared by the entire group to minimize damage. As such, tanks need to be ready to run through her as soon as she switches to Sword, so that she casts Ice Brand on the group before quickly running through her again to turn her back around. The next ability during Sword is Glacial Bash. This is another frontal cone similar to Garuda's Slipstream, and should be dodged by tanks in the same manner. Getting hit by Glacial Bash will stun and do a high amount of damage to you. Shiva should also never be turned towards the group. Whiteout is an AoE ability similar to Lunar Dynamo in turn 9 and should be easily and automatically avoided with your positioning on her butt. Lastly, Shiva will also spawn ice pillars in random areas around the platform that will knock players back. This knockback can be negated by avoiding damage done by these pillars through shields. In sword form, you'll deal with Ice Brand into Glacial Bash into Whiteout. The pillars will spawn randomly throughout this stance. Staff stance will cause Shiva to cast Hailstorm. Similar to Ramuh's Thunderstorm, anyone within the affected player's circle will be hit by falling ice. These players need to move away from the group to avoid unnecessary damage. Since this ability often coincides with ICICLE Impact, which severely limits the safe zones on the platform, groups often assign players to run and stand in specific areas, but we'll get to that soon. Absolute Zero is a raid-wide AoE blast that does a fair amount of damage. Players with stacks of vulnerability will obviously take more damage, and healers need to be ready with shields and heals. Staff stance will begin with Hailstorm, and the raid will spread as necessary. Next, she'll cast ICICLE Impact, followed by Absolute Zero. This will repeat until Phase 2. The first ICICLE Impact pattern you'll encounter can happen in 2 slightly different ways. 1 circle in the middle plus a circle at each cardinal position, or 1 circle in the middle with 1 circle at each intercardinal position. The overlapping pattern of these circles creates 4 safe zones between them, outside of the middle. The entire raid should be split into pairs and assigned to the near and far spot of each of these safe zones. This will have an added layer of complexity in Phase 3, so use Phase 1 to practice getting into position correctly. At 80%, Shiva will spawn 4 adds around the room. These are similar to Ifrit's Nails or Ramuh's adds and must be destroyed before Shiva casts her ultimate. You have until Shiva reaches 70% or 60 seconds after they all spawn, whichever comes first. These are fairly easy to AoE down, and the time limit should give you very little trouble. Shiva will be in sword form during this time, so tanks remember to share Ice Brand with the raid, but keep her turned away for Glacial Bash. Shiva will eventually cast Diamond Dust, wiping the raid if there are any adds remaining. Otherwise, this does anywhere from 2 to 4k damage to the entire group and takes us into phase 3. In this phase, the outer edge of the arena will freeze any player to touch it. Players can be broken out of this by damaging the ice block they're stuck in, but don't make a habit out of it. Shiva will now gain Bow Stance. This will not place any debuffs on the tanks, but will cause her to do a bit more damage. Her major bow ability is Glass Dance, a massive 270-degree cone that will cast in the direction she is facing in at the time. The only safe spot will be directly behind her, and everyone must be on her butt to avoid this damage. Eventually, she will target a random player with Avalanche, indicated by this blue marker. Moments later, she will blast the target with a huge line attack, knocking them and anyone near them back half the length of the platform. To avoid having the entire raid get hit by this, the marked player can move away from the group to a set location. Alternatively, you may move Shiva to the end of the room and have the Avalanche target run directly behind her, ensuring they won't get punted into the wall. Players may also use gap closers after the knockback to avoid hitting the wall as well. Permafrost is an ability that will turn the platform into a giant skating rink. This will apply a debuff on all players called Thin Ice. Should any player move with this debuff, they will lose control of their character and slide across the platform, probably getting frozen on the wall. To avoid this, all players should stop moving until they lose their Thin Ice debuff. Lastly, Icicle Impact will become much more complex and have an added pattern. The 2 options of the first pattern remain, but they are preceded by 4 individual circles at either the cardinal or intercardinal points. Following these 4 circles will be the phase 1 pattern located in the other points of the platform. So if the first 4 are intercardinal, the next pattern will be on the cardinal points, and vice versa. The next icicle pattern will spawn a circle in the center of the room, and then begin spawning circles somewhere around the outside, encircling the platform, identical to Titan's circle bombs. The group should move to the last AoE patch to spawn, wait for the middle to explode, before moving back in. Easy peasy. The entirety of this phase is dealing with the various stances and their respective mechanics while dodging icicle patterns. It may seem overwhelming at first, but is very simple as long as you take each mechanic as it comes. Remember, the first icicle pattern becomes the area for the safe zones, and most mechanics can be easily predicted by watching which stance Shiva is in at the time. The hardest mechanic you'll have to deal with is having the phase 1 icicle pattern happen at the same time as sword stance. Even still, this fight is very forgiving. Good luck and have fun. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.